So, Kjell, you have strong opinions about psychotherapy.
Yes, I think that's accurate. They're evolving opinions, if you will. I mean, my early training was both psychodynamic and cognitive behavioral. So I kind of got the best and the worst of both of those traditions. And what I have become, I think, through the years is increasingly integrative, which fits nicely into Seppi's kind of agenda. And I guess if I had to be labeled, it would be in that constructivist camp. I've always...
So maybe for people who are not so familiar with the label, do you want to give a few words in layman's terms of what constructivist might mean?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think of constructivism as not so much a theoretical orientation to psychotherapy, but a meta-theory, a more philosophical holding position or meta-theory that can incorporate many different techniques of therapy and many different organization or theoretical orientations. It really comes out of a kind of a postmodern view that reality is created or made rather than found. I like the Paul Watzlawick quote, which is the belief that one's own view of reality is the only reality is the most dangerous of all delusions. So, I'm very sensitive to how people, if you will, construct their own view of the world. And now there are a lot of therapies that, will sign up to that. But I've found that I've taken it a little further than that.
So I want to maybe stop you a little bit there to say, in a way, to just recap that in contrast to, say, philosophies that there is a truth and the truth is found and there's a single truth. It really starts from the premise that reality is constructed. So there's more of that relativist approach and paying attention to, in a way, how we construct our reality as opposed to trying to fit some predetermined notion of reality.
I think that's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly right. I remember many years ago, and I've been a therapist and a psychologist and so on for several decades. But one of the first things that kind of struck my fancy was Bandler and Grinder's early, what's it called, the Structure of Reality. No, that's not the name of it. It was their first volume at any rate. And I don't know if you know Bandler and Grinder, but they were regarded as the founders of what's called neuro-linguistic training. And I'm not so much into that per se. And Bandler and Grinder themselves have become kind of controversial historical characters. But in this book, Structure of Magic, they set out on a fairly interesting enterprise, and that is that they noticed that there were many therapists from many, many different persuasions, and there were some that were masters in all of those persuasions, and they'd wondered what there is that these people might have in common that account for their effectiveness rather than the specific theoretical orientations that they have.
Yeah.
And the book really sets up, they used Chomsky's transformational grammar as kind of a model for this, but to boil it down, they were really suggesting that we all have our own models or representations of reality that we carry around with us, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
It's our way of viewing the world and our place in the world. And there's a difference between that model and the representation and the world itself. Our view of ourselves and the world has constraints such as neurological constraints. We don't hear all the frequencies that our cat hears. It has social constraints, like I think the Inuit people are famous from being able to differentiate many types of snow. Mm-hmm. We live in California like I do. Snow is, there's one kind of snow. It's wet and cold, and that's it. And then there are constraints based on people's own learning histories, developmental histories. But their premise was that what all these masters therapists seem to do was, in one way or another, try to get to know what a client's model of reality is. That is, how do you think about things? How do you understand the world? How do you understand yourself? And then to challenge that model in the areas and domains in which that perspective led to a sense of powerlessness, lack of not only being empowered, but things are not good, that didn't work for them in life. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that same frame is one that is it held in. I mean, I think it's a nice way of thinking about therapy overall.
So let me maybe just again try to summarize what I'm hearing. That in a way, what's important is not to confuse reality with the models we have of it.
Yes.
And the characteristics of the master therapist, far from, in a way, feeling that their model is the only one or wanting to impose it on people, is actually having that sense of wanting to pay attention to what the explicit or implicit model that the client has, and helping the client understand the fault lines, the area where this model is actually leading the client to have a sense of powerlessness or stuckness.
Yes.
And in a way, help the client improve their own model of reality as opposed to imposing a model on them.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And so then the question for me has been, how do therapists do that? What is the process for doing that? And it seems to me that the other influence that is underappreciated has to do with physics, if you will, because psychology is largely formed from and based on Newtonian mechanics, sort of that billiard ball universe. And that's very different than a 20th century physics in terms of what's real and what's not real. Again, that kind of constructivist perspective. And so from a more 20th century philosophical perspective, there's a distinction between things. And when I say things, I mean, the furniture in the universe, things that operate perhaps a physical space and time. And of course, there are some philosophers who are called radical constructivists who would say there's nothing out there at all. But for me, the important thing is there's a distinction between things and attributes about things.
So let's talk a little bit about the difference between things and attributes about things. And some examples of that.
Okay. So for example, if I have a chair, and we can all agree that this is something that occupies physical space, that there's something out there called a chair. Now, whether that chair is a comfortable chair, whether it's a useful chair, whether it's an expensive chair, whether it's a short chair or a tall chair, those are the attributes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Those are the events, if you will, plus meaning about events. Or it's the story, which is a common way of thinking about it from some people who are in more narrative schools and so on. It's the event and the story about the event.
Right. And so the event and the story about the event. And so in a way, let's kind of interface that with the notion of truth, that exists in and of itself, or constructed truth.
Yes. Well, what happens, I think, is the way that most of us experience life And part of it is even linguistic, the way in which our language is based on a kind of a more Newtonian philosophy, is that the distinction between things and attributes of things collapse. That is, it looks to people as if the events themselves explain things. It's as if the events are real, the story is real, rather than the story being something we place on or attach to the event or the thing, if you will. Mm-hmm. So, I can elaborate on that a little bit.
So, but let's stay there a little bit. Like there's in a way, let's say the chair.
Yes.
Okay. So at some level, some people might argue that the chair doesn't have a reality either. But we're starting from the premise that actually we accept the reality of the chair.
Right.
But as we go into attributes of the chair, a lot of that is going to have to do with our perceptions of the chair, our baggage about how we perceive the chair, and in a way the stories we kind of make up around the chair.
That's right.
And so often enough what happens is that people tend to end up being so fascinated by the stories that becomes a focal point, and that the stories assume in a way a higher importance, and they're considered what is true as opposed to the chair itself.
Yes. I would argue that most patients who come into therapy, that they then come in with their stories, if you will. They will say, for example, I broke up with my girlfriend yesterday, and so I am distraught, I am upset, I don't see a good future out there. And it is as if the events of the last few days explain their situation. And it's a very convincing story. And frankly, if you're a therapist and you're not empathic to that story in some way, you're probably going to lose your patient. But it's a difference between it's a convincing story and recognizing that it's a story and that it's not real in the sense of chair being real. That one necessarily has to be upset in that way when experiencing a separation, for example. Although there's a lot of social consensus about many of these stories that we have, so that most people would say, yes, it's not surprising this person is distraught. So
in a sense, here what we're talking about is there's a function to the story. The story is in a way born of our innate desire to make sense of things, and so we try to figure out something that gives a possible explanation, and in a way to not stick with something that is unknowable or something that's hard to accept emotionally. And then this rationalization takes on the characteristics of fact.
Yes, exactly. And I don't know if you're familiar with the story of the three umpires, but it kind of captures this nice. You know the story of the three umpires?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's about three umpires in baseball trying to describe how they call balls and strikes. And the first one says, it's easy. If it's a ball, I call it a ball, and if it's a strike, I call it a strike. And the other one, who's a little more sophisticated, says, well, if I see it as a ball, I call it a ball. And if I see it as a strike, I call it a strike. And the third one says, no, you're both wrong. They ain't nothing till I calls them. Meaning, in the game of baseball, the umpire defines reality. Yeah. And you can argue all over the place if you're a batter, but if the umpire says it's a strike, it is in fact a strike.
Yeah.
So it is again part of that how we construct things. So I think that the
interesting part though is in the context of that story, baseball is a game that can only function if it has rules. And the participants agree that one person has the power to define what is, and that's the umpire. So there is both a question of power, but also a question of agreement as to, who has the power. So
Yes.
in a way, it's very similar to, in a way, us as a society giving the power to the Supreme Court to define what is the law and what is not.
Right. Or patients giving the power to therapists and medical personnel to define the reality of their lives.
Yes. So we're in the context what we're talking about. So we're in a context of power and agreements and negotiation, or so that kind of area.
Well, and so for me then, in terms of seeing clients, clients will have very different ways of framing the issues they want to discuss, their problems, if you will. For me, I'm always thinking about a kind of a universal goal about how to empower a client in those domains of their models of reality in which they experience themselves as stuck, disempowered, unhappy, and so on. But I think that therapy takes place in the world of meaning making, and to a large extent, how we define meanings is related to well-being, which is very different than the medical model, because from a medical model perspective, if you are a surgeon, you are dealing with the body as meat. You are not dealing with the meaning-making enterprise. And I think that the laws of physics, let's say, or the principles that govern how meanings change are quite different than how physical events change with Newtonian mechanics.
So let me maybe confuse the issues a little bit by mixing the metaphors. The surgeon, deals with the meat, and so in a way deals with the chair. And in therapy, we deal with the attributes, we deal with the stories that are told about the chair, we deal with the making sense of the chair, as opposed to the physicality of the chair.
Yes. And I think that what clients do when they come in is they, of course, think of what they're experiencing or their problems as real. And I'm using that word, with a capital R, real, kind of like chair is real. And it, in many ways, inhibits their ability to take different perspectives in appreciating their situation. And I think that the therapist is there in part to sort of facilitate that that process.
And I'm very much with you, and that's where, in a way, I love the concept of Winnicott, the play and reality, that in a way we do play therapy with clients, in the sense that we take seriously what people take for reality.
Yes.
But in some way, the taking it seriously is part of what allows us to play with it. Just the same way as you play with a kid. It's a way to manipulate and then transform this experience by being in that zone of play and reality.
Yes, and I think we have to take our clients very seriously, no matter what kind of orientation you're coming from. But a good example of where a patient might take a concept. I mean, psychology is full of concepts. A good example is something like self-esteem. Well, from a reality perspective, there's no such thing as self-esteem. I mean, self-esteem is this conceptual term. But it's interesting that when clients talk about self-esteem, they will say things like, well, I can't possibly go apply for a job because I don't have enough self-esteem. And you've got to fill me up with self-esteem first.
Right.
So I can apply for a job.
Right. Or fill me up with motivation. Give me motivation.
With motivation.
Yeah. Or give me, I have to increase my dose of compassion, or, So in a way, it's like, medieval thinking of the vices and the virtues who are personified.
Say that again, please.
Like in the Middle Ages, they had these passion plays, where they had the vices and the virtues that were played by characters, and so you had, patience, and you had jealousy, and you had, greed, and so they were characters.
Right. Well, a good personal example of how the interesting things that patients get into with seeing reality and having a particular piece of their models that constricts them has to do with the role of feelings and affect. So I remember many years ago going to this outdoor workshop for psychotherapists, experienced psychotherapists, and one day consisted of all these outdoor ropes courses and things. If you're familiar with that, like zip lines and rappelling and one thing or another. And it happened to come the morning after, this was in Southern California, but it came the morning after there had been a freak snowstorm. And we woke up to fog so thick that, I couldn't see beyond 6 or 7 feet through this thick fog. And the task was that everybody was going to go one at a time on this zip line, grabbing a hold of this line and flying across a canyon with several hundred feet below.
Well, at least you don't see it.
Well, yeah, it sort of helped that you didn't see it. But, and then you actually were sprung into it, so like, if you let go, you'd be like a sack of potatoes. You wouldn't fall, but nonetheless, most people were very frightened. And I remember as you lined up to get roped into this harness, there was this very sweet young woman up there, and she said, "How do you feel?" And most people would say something like, "Scared shitless." And she would say, "That's interesting, jump." And what you learned, of course, was how you felt about it was interesting and not insignificant, but it didn't really control whether you jumped or not. In the same way that a client will say, I've had people say, "Well, I'd love to move to California, but, my mother's sick and she wouldn't like it." Now that's their model of reality. You don't leave a sick mother or a mother who doesn't want you to move. Whereas I think that what therapists often do is they play with that. They in fact say, "Well, would she have a heart attack?" Or, what would you think would happen if you went anyway? And in a way to kind of challenge the reality that the client has constructed, and is experienced as very, very real. And then, see, I think that gets into this dance, if you will, that here you have a therapist who has his or her own models of reality. I mean, we can't dispense with those either. And the client has his or her own models of reality. And you're trying to engage and be effective with somebody for whom, at least in some domains, they experience themselves as disempowered or less than whole.
So I want to highlight something there. That in a way, what's happening there is there is an ambiguity and even some kind of a dishonesty, because in a way, covertly or implicitly, we're trying to undermine the person's model and not fully owning, my model is better than yours is shit. And there is an argument at the level of the model. And so, in a way, one is the argument at the level of the model is probably not going to work because the person has, a very strong model just the same way we have ours. But
Yeah.
two, maybe there is also that ambiguity, that kind of, under the radar type of attack, which is very different from what you were describing in the zip line. The woman is just saying, oh, very interesting. And then, in a way, what you think has nothing to do with reality, and separate feelings from action.
Yes. Yes. And, no, I think you're right. There is the difference between the therapist model and the client's model. And in fact, if you as a therapist share some of the same aspects of the model within that domain, I think we call that countertransference, and you're not actually very helpful. I mean, if you just came out of a bad divorce and you think men are no damn good, and that's exactly what your client is experiencing, chances are it's going to be very difficult for you to get the client thinking about different ways of viewing this, and maybe some men are worth, contacting and so on. So, therapists can also fall into that kind of trap. And I think when I think of challenging the model, I don't mean necessarily shaking the client and saying, listen, you're not thinking about this very well, because I think that every theoretical technique or orientation has their own way of doing that. I mean, Rogerians who do it through listening and having the client talk more and more about their own ways of seeing things find themselves questioning themselves. Behavior therapists who assign assignments for people to go out and check and find out that things aren't so bad when they try them do that. Gestalt therapists who put and use an empty chair and have them look at two different sides of themselves and test part of what they're thinking and feeling. And it goes on and on. I mean, you can do it, get the same place with many different approaches. But I think fundamentally that's kind of what you're doing. And it becomes, if you will, this dance between the therapist and the client, where the advantage that the therapist has is that if the therapist is not attached to one particular outcome or way of seeing things, then the therapist can keep making attributions indefinitely, can keep checking it indefinitely, can keep encouraging looking at things from multiple perspectives or experimenting indefinitely. And that's the power advantage that the therapist has in that system, if you will.
Yeah. So in a way, what's happening is that what we're doing is treating the client as an experimental scientist, and looking at their concept, their model, as a working hypothesis as opposed to a dogma. Yeah. And, through experience, to enrich their model.
Yes.
And obviously, if we have our own dogma and we're attached to a certain view, we're not going to have the flexibility to actually truly help the client, build a model, but it's going to be a bit of a warped process.
Yes. No, I think that's a very good way of putting it. And I think further, it's not in that Newtonian way, it is not so linear and predictable. And that's where I think that destabilizing dance is one in which the therapist might intervene. But here's where it gets into the parallel for me, and I'm not a physicist or I totally understand at that level, but I think of Prigoghine's work with dissipative structures or open-ended, non-linear kinds of systems. Because I think that the relationship between the therapist and the client is a form of open system.
So let's talk a little bit more about that. That's a non-linear open system.
Well, I think that there's a relationship between the client and the therapist that is influenced not only by what goes on in the room, and how they have defined what they're going to choose to discuss and how they kind of co-create the problem, if you will. I don't think the problem's real, but we're going to co-create it for the purposes of the therapy. But the client is also exposed to other influences, and the therapist is too. So what apparently happens, according to, and here I'm thinking of Prigogine, who won a Nobel Prize for his work on dealing with these nonlinear systems. And what he argues is that when you perturb a system, it gets, discombobulated. It gets thrown up. But how it comes back and reconfigures itself is to a large extent unpredictable. Whether that new form is, how different it is and whether it is, quote, better. And here I mean better by, for me, that you look for an outcome in therapy when a client says, that feels good. Now my life makes sense. I feel like I have more options. I feel like I have more power. Everything's right in the universe. But I can't guarantee through any particular intervention if that's going to happen when that system gets perturbed. And the advantage then of the therapist is he or she can keep going rather indefinitely until something like that starts to happen, where if things reconfigure or land or make sense in a way that actually seems like progress. And I'm always sort of thrown for a loop that typically if I see somebody for a period of time and we terminate therapy, and assuming that it's been a good experience for them, where I will say to my client, well, so what made a difference to you? What helped? And sometimes they'll point at the damnedest thing. They'll say, well, I remember that session a month ago when you said this. And it just made a profound difference for me.
Right.
And I will hardly remember what I said. It wasn't programmed in that way.
Yeah.
It really came out of the therapist creatively sort of drawing upon how to intervene empathically and through understanding the client's model and trying to challenge it in some way.
Yeah. So in a way, it's a sense that if we get too caught up in having a plan for here's how we're going to change the model or get the client to understand this or that, we're in some way in fantasy that in a way what we know we can deliver is a process in which the foundations of the, in a way, faulty working assumptions are challenged, and a process in which it is possible to have the creativity to, rebuild this. But we cannot guarantee which way it's going to be rebuilt or how or in what form.
Exactly. And, I think I've used the image or the parallel between the expert therapist and the novice therapist as similar to the expert skier and the novice skier. And if you put both of them on the top of a very difficult ski run, a double black diamond run or something, and you ask the novice, how are you going to get down the mountain? The novice will say, I'm going to avoid that snow over here, and I'm going to be careful about that mogul over here, and I'm going to try to go to that little flat space over there, and so on. And then you ask the expert, how are you going to get down this run? And that person will say, beats me, see you at the bottom. And then when they're at the bottom, they can reconstruct what they did. But the advantage that the expert has is, he or she has a lot of experience, and they carry, in effect, this pack on their back that is full of the experience that they've had in the field and the various kinds of tools that they have in their bag. And then they have tremendous intentionality of focusing on the goal, and the goal is to get to the bottom of the mountain. Whereas the novice is kind of painting by numbers.
Right. But so in a way, another way to put it is that the expert has the experience to be able to be in process during the going down the slope, whereas the novice, in a way, is so intimidated by it that they have to go in a strategic way and try to plan as opposed to working moment by moment with what happens.
Exactly. And I think that's a very automatic way, and a way in which everybody learn, or most people learn in some way. Interestingly, more adults than children. Children seem to often learn by just, they don't learn how to ride a bike by going through the steps. They sort of focus on the goal and they ride the bike. But most adults, when they learn skills, you learn it by painting the numbers, and then you get better at it, and then you feel more like you can go off base, and you don't have to follow the manual quite the way you follow the manual. And it becomes as much art as science at some point.
The same way as, say, an artist, a musician, learns painstakingly, plays scales, rehearses, learns a piece, and at some point is able to play it with spirit.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess, what I would say from this is that I think that there are some kinds of therapy interventions that sort of fall naturally from thinking about the importance of meaning making here, and that are interventions that transcend any kind of particular orientation. And I sort of would offer them, when I do either training of newer therapists and so on, I would say that there are certain things that you can consider that I think will help you become a more powerful therapist in this way. And they would include things like frequently asking people what they want. That's a good thing to do because it keeps them goal-focused. Mm-hmm. I think learning to separate meanings from attributed meanings, or attributed meanings from facts, if you will, the reality from the attributions. And one of the ways in which I encourage people to do that is that sometimes I don't understand what a client is saying until I have like a video picture. And it doesn't have to be a real video, but I'd like it described in enough detail so I have a picture of it. And, an example would be the mother who comes in and complains that her kid has tantrums. Well, I don't know if by tantrum she means he occasionally disagrees with her or he literally is tearing the house apart.
Right.
And so if I get kind of the video sense of what that's like, then I have a much better idea of what I'm dealing with. I think various forms of the so what question are good. And by that I mean not necessarily the straightforward so what, but it is the person who says, I can't do that because my roommate wouldn't like it. Well, what I'm thinking is, so what? Mm-hmm. Tell me more about your model where you can't have a roommate not disagreeing with you. I mean, that's essentially what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
And I think the other one is, and I think this is a really important one, is I think that the more therapists can become conscious of their own assumptions and presuppositions, that if they were to entertain letting them go, would give their clients more power. And here would be a common example. There's a lot of literature that shows that people who have been sexually abused, let's say, have a more difficult time with forming adult romantic sexual relationships in a healthy way. But it's not a perfect correlation. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of people have been sexually abused who seem to do pretty darn well with their adult relationships.
Right. And so in a way, we see a stereotype instead of seeing the person.
That's right. Yeah, because there's such social convention for that particular story.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And
So if you experiment with letting go with that a bit, you give the client a lot more room.
not to mention that there is something a little crazy about telling the client, in a way, that we're engaged in the enterprise of helping the client free themselves from, in a way, a dogmatic structure that's not adapted. So, the very least we could do is to be in a place of not being so attached to our own structures.
Yes.
But
and it's very hard to do that. I mean, we're stuck in the same system. And a really good example is how much time therapy should take.
yeah,
There are difficult problems and they should take a long time, or we expect them to. There are easy problems, we expect them to be brief therapy. But the fact is that time is a kind of a Newtonian way of looking at things, the way we think of linear time. But it's not a very good model for time for thinking about how you change meaning attributions. If I say to you, how long does it take you to fall in love? Or how long does it take you to change your mind? The metric doesn't fit the issue.
Not to mention the examples of this is the instant change that took a lifetime to happen, or that took 25 years to happen. And so both can be true, that something happens within a fraction of a second, but also that there is all of this other stuff that made it possible.
Exactly.
But so maybe let's go into the part of what is the experience, in a way, as we're human beings and we're just like everybody else, we're going to have the sense of either not seeing our own, blind spots, or they're having that attachment to our own theories, our own prejudices, our own biases, which, we don't think of as biases, but think as very legitimate and empowering. But yes. So, in a way, how do we deal with letting go of that and having that flexibility?
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. I mean, I don't have an easy answer for that. I think it's one of the reasons it's good for therapists to persist in not only their own therapy, but exposing themselves to different contexts and multicultural experiences, for example. I think that we are becoming a little more sensitive to the contextual nature of reality through different cultural experiences and developmental experiences. I think exposure of that sort helps a lot.
The other part for me that I would add is a sense of compassionate wisdom of noting my own limitations. And in a way, seeing, it's very easy from my place to see this person on the other side, who's not wanting to change and so on. But then to have the reminder of how, at this moment it seems very easy for me to fix that person, but to be aware of how much in so many circumstances I have trouble shifting, changing, letting go, seeing things in a different perspective, and in a way forming an alliance with the client from that place of difficulty being flexible and wanting to change.
Well, exactly. And it's those times I step out of and need to step out of the expert role and want to put myself more as the learner, if you will, the person who is curious. I mean, I think curiosity is a wonderful therapist trait, or any trait for anybody, and really wanting to understand more fully how the person has come to the position of thinking and believing and creating the reality that they use to run their lives, and sort of being empathic to the necessity, if you will, that went into that, the wisdom at the time that went into creating that, because most of those things, no matter how self-destructive, were survival mechanisms at some point.
So in a way, I want to change a little bit what you're saying to see if it's what, corresponds to what you mean. That in a way, if as a therapist, I am in a place of, in a way, starting to feel impatient by the client not wanting to change, then I take, instead of, in a way, acting on that, it's a signal to me that actually I don't get it. and I haven't done my job. Because my job, it's not that the client changes, but my job is to understand what it is that is the client's vision, the client's model, that prevents them from changing. And so my impatience is not a sign that I'm smarter and I get it, but it's actually that I'm not smart and I'm not able to get that model in order to understand the stuckness of the client.
Yeah. No, you're right. It's the strong commitment, with the model that they have created that becomes, seems quite impenetrable. Mm-hmm. And, I think that some therapists are better than others for dealing with those kinds of impenetrable or, what we call resistance sometimes models. But oftentimes it has to do with, quote, going with the resistance rather than trying to fight it head on. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Which really comes with giving the person a lot of space and a lot of appreciation, a lot of empathy, and having them, rather than trying to get them to change something.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so from this place, I want to circle back to, in a way, where we started in that view, the constructivist view of reality, truth. It's not something that there is a truth. It's something that we construct, that the client constructs, that we're helping. So how can we, in a way, circle back to that to find a way to, to encapsulate what we've been talking about?
Wow. That's hard to, let's see how to encapsulate that. Well, I don't, from that perspective, I don't think that therapy changes anything. Certainly not anything in the way that we're discussing as a reality out there. And I think that that's important to appreciate. I mean, I play tennis, and sometimes I'll say to myself, I've got to change my serve. But it's an interesting linguistic comment, because it sort of implies that there is some serve out there in the universe that I'm going to modify and fix, Mm-hmm. Whereas I think what I'm really saying is one day I serve one way and next day I serve another way, rather than changing the serve. So I think that if we can get out of the mindset of having to change anything, that even that helps.
So maybe let's use I think there's a beauty in the experience of the example you use of the serve. Yeah. Because the everyday language thing is it's expressed in terms of I'm going to change my serve, but actually the practice of ever being able to accomplish any progress there is going to be the intentionality to be more mindfully observing the serve, to pay attention to what other people are doing, either in what we directly observe or reading about it or asking people. But in a way, that kind of dialogue between observing what we do, getting inspiration from other sources, experimenting, so that, in a way, we enrich the process. As opposed to having a mechanical process of going from A to B, which is what the linguistic image of changing my serve would seem to imply.
Yes. Yeah, I think you put an eloquent coda or synopsis of that better than I could have done. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, it was really nice because when you used that example, it spoke to me.
Great.
Yeah. Well, so is this a good place to end, or do you want to add something to?
No, I think this is fine to end. I'm sure that afterwards I'll have lots of thoughts about things I could have said, but it feels to me, does it feel like it?
Yeah. I think that to me, what's interesting is, in a way, we started with that idea of, in a way, certainties, truth, good, bad, what is real. Yeah. We went into that whole concept of stories and confusing the stories for reality. And from there, we went into, in a way, something that's a process And in a way, with that story of the serve, it comes into an idea that there is an engagement from both the therapist and the client to go into a co-constructed creative process to, in a way, explore, make sense, enrich, play, in a way, get out of whatever might be rigid, but come back to something that's more creative and open, and therefore grow.
I thought of one more example I could give that touches on this, and it has to do with how the quote problem that is chosen in therapy to work with. And because I liked what you were saying about how to think about what you're doing in that creative, enriching way. And I think what sometimes happens with therapists is that they will define the problem as something that's very entrenched. And I think of, there's a story about Jay Haley, who, long-term provocative therapist and writer and so on in the field. And he's talking about when he was doing supervision with a student in therapy. And the student came to him for supervision hour, and Haley said, well, what's the problem? And his supervisor said, well, the problem is this symbiotic relationship between this mother and her daughter. And Haley says, oh, I'd never let that be the problem. And the reason being that symbiosis, why do you want to tackle something that feels so messy, so rigidified? Frame it another way. Pick another problem. Don't call it that. Call it something else. And I think that that's really important to understand the power of both language and then how language translates into how we create and understand ourselves in the world. And the more you can think about it in ways that offers a little bit of movement and flexibility and playing, as you were saying, the better the outcomes have to be, I think.
So in a way, if what you do is you define the issue in terms of a wall, that the only thing you can do is bang your heads against, basically what's going to happen is you're going to bang your head against a wall. And the point about it is the only way there's going to be change is if there is some movement. So basically the point is to try and find an entry point in which there is the possibility of movement and play.
Yeah, that's it.
Great. Well, thanks, Joe. This recording is part of the podcast at relationalimplicit.com.
In the world. And the more you can think about it in ways that offers a little bit of movement and flexibility and playing, as you were saying, the better the outcomes have to be, I think.
So in a way, if what you do is you define the issue in terms of a wall, that the only thing you can do is bang your heads against, basically what's going to happen is you're going to bang your head against a wall. And the point about it is the only way there's going to be change is if there is some movement. So basically the point is to try and find an entry point in which there is the possibility of movement and play.
Yeah, that's it.
Great. Well, thanks, Joe. This recording is part of the Somatic Mindfulness and Relational Psychotherapy podcast. See the website relationalimplicit.com.